It is 7 o'clock. You're watching a Sky News special, the BBC in Crisis, a Q&A. When will the revelations end? As tonight, a second young person makes allegations against the unnamed BBC presenter. We'll ask the questions the BBC's Director General needs to answer, as it's revealed that the presenter wasn't spoken to until 7 weeks after the complaint was made. Tonight, I'll be joined by guests who've been at the sharp end at the corporation and beyond. We'll also ask if the Sun newspaper needs to answer some questions too over its treatment of the story after the young person at the centre of the allegations allegedly rubbishes its claims. Plus, we'll ask whether anything can really ever remain secret in today's social media landscape and look at the potential consequences for the famous and those online. Good evening. You're watching a Sky News special programme on the crisis at the BBC. Now, it's 4 days since we learned that an unnamed BBC presenter has been accused of paying for explicit images from a young person, starting when that person was 17. Now, tonight, it's being reported that a second individual says that they felt threatened by the unnamed presenter and were sent abusive, expletive-filled messages after hinting they can name them online. Now, in a moment, I'll be putting questions to our panel of experts. But first, Sky's Home Affairs editor, Jason Farrell, is here with us. And Jason, this story just keeps evolving. Tell us the latest, as we understand it, at just gone 7.
Yeah, it feels like we've had a week of developments in the last 24 hours. Only 24 hours ago, we were talking about the young person saying that this development was rubbish. Then we had the Sun newspaper with the parents coming out and saying that everything they'd said was true and actually the BBC was lying. Then this morning we've had the BBC lay out its timeline of events. And I think that is significant. So for the first time we've seen the BBC say exactly how this complaint came in, how they responded, i.e. that they sent an email getting clarification that they didn't get a response to. Then they said they made a phone call about 3 weeks later, which they didn't get a response to. Then they left it a month, and then the Sun came out with its story. And only then did they speak to the presenter. Only then were senior executives and the Director General aware of this story. So there's all sorts of questions then came out about the BBC's handling. We saw the Director General being interviewed on The World at One, where the presenter said, everyone in this building knows who it is. There was just been extraordinary development. And his defence for not naming the individual is around privacy, around duty of care by the BBC. But then the BBC's own reporters then come out with a story at 4 o'clock this afternoon saying there's another allegation. This time the presenter has been into a dating chat room, has arranged to meet up in a more private chat room, and has revealed himself to someone, wanted to meet up, didn't happen, and then when the person says that they might reveal who the presenter is, the presenter has become threatening. We've talked about menacing messages. We haven't seen them, but menacing in nature. So again, the story opens up in a different way. Who knows where it will go next?
Absolutely. And Jason, thank you for that. And before I introduce our panel of experts here to talk us through what the BBC is facing, in the last few moments, one of the BBC's main presenters, Jeremy Vine, has tweeted. Now, he, of course, was harassed on social media with people thinking that he was the person at the centre of this, but Jeremy Vine has tweeted in the past half an hour or so saying, I'm starting to think that the BBC presenter involved in the scandal should now come forward publicly. These new allegations will result in yet more vitriol being thrown at perfectly innocent colleagues of his, and the BBC, which I'm sure he loves, is on its knees with this. But it is his decision and his alone. So pressure there being piled on. Now, we're going to start by asking the one question that we can't actually answer for you. Who is the person at the centre of this? And we're going to get Jason to explain why it is that Sky News aren't naming the person that is alleged to be at the centre of this.
No, I'm not going to answer that question. And there's a number of reasons why I and other journalists are not answering that question. And the key one is really privacy laws. And the Supreme Court actually came out with a new ruling on this only last year, which essentially protects an individual even when they're under investigation. So only after they get charged is there a necessity to name them. Now, obviously, if a newspaper thinks it's got slam dunk, absolutely solid information that a crime's been committed, they might then say, we're going to name them anyway. But that's not necessarily the case here with The Sun. And in fact, the sense from their statement is that they feel that the BBC has acted inappropriately in the face of the allegations, some of which they say they've seen supporting evidence of, but perhaps not enough to come out with the name themselves. And certainly if we haven't seen the evidence they've got, other media outlets aren't going to. And then, of course, on top of that, there's the defamation laws where if someone says libelous about something libelous about an individual, they could, of course, sue.
Absolutely right. OK, Jason, thank you for that. Now, with us to pick through many of the questions that we had this evening are Lauren Beeching, founder of crisis management agency Honest London, Persephone Bridgman-Baker, a media lawyer and partner at Carter Ruck, and Akil Ahmed, Professor of Media at the University of Bolton and a former head of religion and ethics at the BBC and at Channel 4. Guys, thank you so much for being with us this evening. Plenty to get to. Let's start with you, Persephone, and these latest allegations, if we can, because, of course, we must remember that nothing illegal has been alleged yet entirely. We're not certain exactly when this began. So do these latest allegations change anything, do you think, materially about the situation we're facing?
I don't think they change anything materially. Obviously, the more allegations that mount up, the more pressure there is going to be on this individual to either step out and name themselves or on the BBC to consider naming them. But as Jason rightly says, this individual still has the protection of anonymity, which is pretty much settled law in this country now. That means that he can't be named. And these further allegations don't go to, for example, or don't appear to go to abuses of position within his profession or any further allegations of criminality. So I don't think that the new allegations change the position dramatically. And
Akil, would you agree with that? And let's also remember as well what we've just reported, Jeremy Vine coming out and saying that this person should perhaps name themselves.
Well, I think that's easy for Jeremy to say, isn't it, really? I mean, I can understand where he's coming from himself, from his own position, but actually, you know, it's not for him to tell somebody what to do. We don't know the circumstances of the other individual involved. Generally, it's all unfolding as we go along. And to answer the first bit of the question, well, it changes something, not necessarily the nature of any, because we don't know about any illegality, obviously, but it does change something, which is this is somebody coming forward now because this story is out there. And we don't know who else will come forward, and we don't know what else we will learn from this. So in that sense, the lack of control, as it were, that anybody seems to have over the story is resulting in this. You know, because the emails have been reported about. Actually, we've not seen them, but the BBC have actually. I believe, Jeremy, the BBC have seen them, haven't they? And they said that actually they are of a particular menacing nature. So therefore, we know it's real. So therefore, there will be more that comes out. So that's what I would say. It has changed, not necessarily any illegality, but what has changed as the story is getting wider, and now nobody is in control.
Perhaps more complicated as well, Lauren. It's a reputation management perspective. Of course, you knew that was the question I was going to ask you. Talk to us about the individual at the centre of this, how you would be advising them, and the BBC more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, from the individual, now with the second person coming forward, without a doubt now I would be saying, you need to just come clean. That would be my personal advice. I think that's the only way the person being accused right now can take control of the narrative. I think he's going to be named imminently. I just feel like it's going to come out eventually. So I feel take control of the situation and produce an incredibly strong statement. Very compelling. If there's any way he can prove any slight innocence in this, if there's any evidence he has, put it out there. And just be a fellow colleague to your other colleagues that are, like Jeremy Vine correctly said, they're being scrutinised and it's just not fair on them.
Let's widen that. Persephone, what do you think about as a strategy?
Yeah, it's difficult to... I mean, different clients want to take different approaches in these situations, but there's certainly something to be said for getting ahead of the media, controlling the narrative and trying to get something out there that might put your position out there a bit more neatly and coherently, because at the moment, the only person not speaking in all of this is the person that's been accused.
And Jason, you know, what's your take on this? I mean, the pressure is being piled on, isn't it, by Jeremy Vine by saying this? And I guess Jeremy Vine's tweeting. He wasn't the only person over the weekend that was being harassed on social media. There could be others that come out and say the same thing.
Yeah, I mean, I've no doubt that there's some thought within the BBC that now they would rather like this individual to come out and say whatever it is they need to say. And, it's obviously a personal decision for that particular individual. But I think the big problem is that point that was made by the BBC presenter, essentially saying, look, everybody in this building knows. And if everybody in the BBC knows, literally everybody, the public will start to learn, if they haven't already, who it is. So it almost becomes a pointless question in a way. So then you would say, well, I don't do the roles you do, but you would say, well, look, if everybody knows, then that would seem like the sensible thing to do.
Well, normally I would say you're right, actually, because that's what I do as well. I was going to say, get on top of the situation, control it, be on the front foot rather than reacting. But the story is unfolding. The police are not using the word investigate. There doesn't seem to be any evidence of any illegality at the moment. So you could argue that you may be able to ride this out a little bit longer and actually be in more control of the situation once it starts to calm down, if the stories stop developing. So there is another side to this, but I think ultimately it all boils down to the same thing. You've got to be in control, so they must have a Q&A or a plan, as it were, a strategy for how they will deal with this and all the various different permutations.
Yeah, and we'll address how the BBC should perhaps deal with it shortly, guys. Thank you for that. Well, let's just look at what the BBC have been telling us as this scandal has unfolded. Now, the broadcaster has said it didn't put the allegations made by the family of the young person to the accused presenter until 7 weeks after they were first raised. The Director General, Tim Davie, had this to say when he was asked why it had taken so long for the presenter to be confronted.
If you've got an allegation coming into a corporate investigations team, and I think you need to balance the concerns of duty of care, privacy, all those things I've talked about. I don't think you take that complaint direct to a presenter. If you just work that through, if anything that comes through or any call that hasn't been verified just gets brought in front of someone, what I would say is it is important at that point, I think this is right, to validate that, to have our, not just the Audit Services team, but the specialists talk to that individual, understand their concerns and go through that process. I think that's essential.
Tim Davie speaking earlier to the World at One, being asked questions by Sarah Montague. Now, the BBC have revealed a timeline about the complaint made against the presenter. On the 18th of May, a family member of the young adult at the centre of all of this went to a BBC building to make the complaint. A day later, they contacted BBC Audience Services, who escalated it. Now, it was assessed as not criminal, but requiring further investigation. The BBC emailed the complainant the same day, asking for more information, but got no response. 3 weeks later, the BBC made a phone call to the complainant, which did not connect. A month later, The Sun informed the BBC about the story, including new allegations. Now, this was the first time that the Director General or other executives became aware of the case. A senior BBC manager held the first conversation with the presenter in question about the allegations later that same day, and they agreed the presenter would be taken off air. The next day, the BBC contacted the police, and on Monday, the BBC met with the police, who asked the BBC to pause their investigation while officers assess the case. All right, so here's that question I said we were going to be answering, or trying to at least. How has the BBC handled this scandal? Lauren, what do you think?
They could have done better, right. So, to put it lightly. I feel...
What would have been a better way of them dealing with that? So
I think the main issue comes down to what their inner workings of how they're dealing with complaints. So I feel 7 weeks, I mean, it's inexcusable, really. I feel if they had nipped it in the bud straight away, as soon as they received it, spoken to the correct people, raised it with senior management. I don't know how the runnings of their work, but I feel that would generally be how it would work. They would see something labelled sort of red, raise it. And I feel then that would have stopped this whole media scrutiny. It would have stopped this crisis happening. It would have stopped innocent people having targets on their back. And also the victim as well. Like, it's just caused uproar for absolutely no reason. And I just feel it's something that they just need to fix within.
I think their argument was, though, that they get so many kind of complaints on a daily basis that they have to kind of be a bit judicious about which ones they raise up to people. You don't buy that?
No,
so, yeah.
I really do, and I think this is really tricky for the BBC. And what makes it most tricky is that we don't know what these allegations are. We don't know how serious they were. We don't know the context in which they were made. We don't know how they were imparted. There are
they went and knocked on the door of a building in a city that we don't know.
It's quite unusual. And as you say, the BBC may receive many of these allegations, and and some of them may be ones that they have to take through the proper channels, and some of them may not be. And because we just don't know yet, the BBC's come heavily under fire for the way that they've dealt with this, and I just don't think we have enough information at the moment. Of course, these allegations, as we heard from Jason, around 24 hours later in the public eye, were refuted by the very victim himself. So, goodness me, it's just a really chaotic situation for the BBC to be trying to deal with.
And Michael, the former BBC man on the panel, you'll know a little bit about the inner workings.
Well, I think Tim talked earlier on about 250 serious complaints, not just complaints, but serious complaints in a 6-month period. I mean, and they did this. So this was an investigation that was opened. An email was sent. No one replied to it. Then there's not one person looking after this. There's a person looking after probably about 50 or 20 or 40 cases. So the investigation was ongoing. And it is, but obviously it's escalated.
I mean, you did actually say it was never closed.
It was never closed, yeah. No, we can have an argument about whether or not that 7 weeks was too long, but the fact of the matter is there was an investigation going on, and this would have been dealt with, as it has been dealt with.
I mean, I guess questions can be asked as whether they should have sent more emails or maybe tried to make more phone calls, because one of each is probably not quite enough. Let's bring in David Elstein now, former chief executive of Channel 5 and also a former BBC producer. There he is, over that side. David, good to have you with us. It's a shame you're not in the studio. We've got plenty of people here, but nice to have you in the screen anyway.
It's very crowded.
It's a little crowded. Listen, pick up on this point then. How do you think the BBC has handled this scandal?
Well, I'm sorry to see this special defined as BBC in crisis, because you have to ask yourself, what has the BBC done wrong? One of its employees, one of its high-profile presenters, is alleged to have done something. Was it criminal? In that case, it's a matter for the police. If it's not criminal, what is it that requires, and I frankly had no idea the BBC had an investigations unit. It sounds really Orwellian. I would have been shocked when I was working at the BBC to hear that there was an in-house investigations unit. The thing is that people's private lives are private lives. People can do unwise things, as Philip Schofield might put it, even things that might shock someone. They might have affairs. They might try to approach people 30 years younger than themselves. All of these might happen, but why is the BBC investigating them unless there's something that is going to bring the BBC into disrepute and therefore might involve a breach of contract? So I think that the way the whole issue has been put is really unfortunate for the BBC, and the BBC has made itself a target for everyone to pile in on. Every politician who's ever stood in an election in East Berwick or West Lothian feels free to have a go at the BBC, do an investigation, do one faster. And then the police say, no, stop your investigation. And if I were Tim Davie, I'd be very nervous of being held responsible for impeding a police investigation. So, frankly, I find the whole situation not just Orwellian, but rather Kafkaesque as well. It's so grotesque. David, I mean, the Guardian's media editor today asks Tim Davie, have you examined the presenter's phone? I mean, what world does the Guardian live in? David. The Stasi? Why would Tim Davie want to examine?
Sorry to interrupt you, David. Just I want to bring in our other guests as well, David, and I want to put a point to you, because the reason I guess that it has been elevated to this level is because the allegation is that the person at the time that first contact was made was 17, and there may well have been the soliciting of pictures of a person under the age, which is why. Now that said, of course, it hasn't gone to the police in terms of that yet, but that I think is why it's been raised up to this level.
I understand that, but the first thing you say to the complainant is there a criminal act? If so, please report it to your local police station. The BBC is not a law enforcement agency. The only thing that the BBC needs to look after is whether one of its employees is going to bring it into disrepute, by doing something which is potentially a breach of contract. But it's not the BBC that we should be talking about as being in crisis. It's the media for turning this into a free-for-all with poor old Tim Davie yet again, the punch bag that everyone likes to have a go at. I think they behave foolishly in not passing it off to the police straight away.
Okay.
And saying,
David,
over to you.
Appreciate that. Persephone, pick up on some of that. I don't know where you want to start with.
So we have heard recently that it was referred to the police as well, and they initially decided not to investigate because they weren't sure that those were criminal allegations. I do think I have some sympathy there with you need to make sure that you're investigating the right sort of circumstances. It's simply, again, that we're back to we don't know what was alleged.
We don't know what happened,
But it is important that the BBC makes sure that its presenters aren't bringing the BBC into disrepute. They're a public service broadcaster. One might say that adds additional obligations onto them. And so I think in those situations, one would want to make sure that one's employees were behaving in a professional and proper manner.
But pick up on that private life thing as well that David mentioned there. I mean, sort of, how bad in your private life can you be to keep your job at the BBC, do you know?
Well, some of these allegations, the dating room allegations, are truly private allegations.
Right.
But
which shouldn't have any impact on the person's employment.
They shouldn't, but if they are then aired, that is likely to bring, or possibly could bring, the BBC into disrepute. So we are really travelling a very fine line here between what's in the public interest and what someone's doing in their private life.
Yeah. Let's just bring sort of the other party in this, another party, which is the Sun newspaper, of course, which published the allegations to start with. Now, they first brought this story to the public's attention, but the individual at the centre of the allegations has told the BBC through their lawyer that nothing inappropriate took place with the unnamed presenter. The Sun, however, says the parents of the young person involved stand by their comments. Now, does the Sun have questions to answer? You're having a drink, so I'll start with you, Akhil. What do you think?
Well, we don't know if they have questions to answer again.
OK, but let's think about the journalism then.
Journalistically, journalism 101, right? If you don't have the facts, you don't publish, right? Which is what we'll go on to that, I'm sure, when we talk about Twitter. Now, with regards to the Sun newspaper, I just want to know, they've got all this information. Why have we not seen any of it?
Do you think they should be publishing it?
Well, I mean, I'm quite surprised that actually, if they have the bank statements, etc., why are we not seeing redacted versions of those bank statements? If they have imagery, etc., why are we not seeing redacted versions of the imagery? All of this stuff is actually, it doesn't seem like they were normal behaviour from a tabloid newspaper. Plus, also, just a last point, when the person involved allegedly, got in touch with the newspaper, they doubled down a little bit and said it's up to the BBC to do a proper investigation, which would suggest they might not have done a proper investigation themselves.
Due diligence.
Yeah.
Well, before I bring you in, let me get David's point as the other sort of journo on the panel. David, what do you think of that? Should the Sun answer a few questions and as Akhil said, publish their evidence?
Well, the Sun will, in due course, come under quite severe scrutiny because why haven't they been quizzing the mother and the stepfather with some questions like, how do you know it's £35,000? When did you know it was £35,000? How long have you known that something you don't approve of has been going on? Why have you waited to now? And if your son or stepson denies that anything improper has happened, what makes you so certain that something has? Where is your evidence? So the mother and stepfather are being shielded by the Sun because the Sun is choosing to believe them over the young person involved. So the time will come when the spotlight will switch from the BBC, perhaps to the Sun, perhaps to the parents. But it's not quite there yet.
Well, we can keep talking about it, David, because as you know, the Sun is an entity into and sometimes a bit of a law unto itself. So they have no obligation to publish this evidence, do they? And they can keep churning out new lines from this story as they see fit.
Well, once they start accusing the BBC of being liars, they get closer and closer to the line where that bite back happens. Look, the Sun's a pretty impressive newspaper journalistically. It breaks a lot of important stories, and the people who run it are actually used to be the same people who ran Sky News until Sky News was sold to Comcast. So there's no doubt in my mind that the decision to publish this story was not taken lightly. What I regret is that The Sun have turned it into an anti-BBC story because the presenter in question happens to work for the BBC. I mean, when you employ 22,000 people, the chances that you might have someone who's done something improper or even criminal is quite high. And I think The Sun should have targeted the individual, not the BBC. But that's the way they operate.
All right, David, that sale happened in 2018 as well, just for the record. All right, Persephone, just on The Sun, I mean, Kelvin MacKenzie, former Sun editor, did say yesterday, in the good old days, they would have published the name and the pictures already. I mean, first, on the premise of that, whatever, but the good old days? There's
been a big shift in privacy law since the good old days. Yeah. And, you know, the Cliff Richard case against the BBC was eventually settled for somewhere in the region of £2 million in damages and costs. So it's a significant risk to name somebody who's associated with a potential criminal investigation. And as, you know, rightly said, they will not have taken the decision to publish this story lightly.
Yeah, and that's the thing, isn't it, Lauren? Because they will have made a decision and they're running with this story for days. As like I said, they've doubled down in some instances, so they must be pretty confident of their sourcing.
They seem to be. I mean, the speed that they came back out with that statement last night was astonishing. I wasn't expecting to hear it that fast, but I'm in complete agreement. I was so confused that no sort of bank statements blurred out, any information was shared. I found that really bizarre because I wouldn't be sharing any sort of key information about that person. It would just be a little bit of evidence, which, I don't know, it just seems incredibly out of character.
Should they be just trying to make the story run for another few days?
Well,
I mean,
maybe.
Well, I think David's right. They've tried to... This is a story about the BBC rather than the actual incident. And actually, I think the key thing here is actually maybe it's about regulation as well, because, you know, we're sat in this room here and we know the level of regulation, the level of hoops we would have to go through before we could even... just calling the BBC liars is a big thing, you know, but actually it seems like the Sun probably feel they can get away with some of this because the regulation of newspapers is nowhere near as thorough as the regulation of television and radio.
We haven't even touched on the fact that this has come just a couple of days before the BBC published their annual reports, which of course came out today. We'll touch on that later, I'm sure. All right, now, this whole saga is sure to feature in tomorrow morning's newspapers. We're going to have our extended press preview and news review from 10:30 with tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Now, joining Anna will be the journalist and broadcaster Jenny Kleeman and also Ali Miraj. So stay with us for that. Starts at 10:30. Now, if you scan the QR code that you see right now on screen, you can listen to the latest edition of the Sky News Daily. In it, Kimberly Leonard will be looking at the crisis at the BBC. You can subscribe to that podcast wherever you get your podcasts on a daily basis or through the Sky News app. All right, plenty more to come this hour on this Sky News special programme looking at the BBC in crisis. Next, we're going to examine how this situation may have changed the entire media landscape. Hello there and welcome back. You're watching a Sky News special on the BBC in crisis. Now, the claims against the unnamed BBC presenter prompted frenzied speculation over the presenter's identity on social media. Several BBC stars have now spoken out to distance themselves from the allegations, including Nicky Campbell, Gary Lineker and Ryland Clark. So, with allegations from a second young person and even more pressure online, can anyone survive a scandal while maintaining full privacy over their identity? I mean, it's kind of a big question. Arka, let's start with you. I mean, the pile-on over the weekend was quite astounding. And each time this sort of thing happens, we're getting more and more of this, aren't we? That people just feel like they can throw anything out on social media and become their own sort of
I think
detectives.
it says quite a lot about social media and the lack of regulation, or complete lack of regulation. But actually, the fact of the matter is, the laws of the land apply, and a lot of people are shocked to find out that actually they could get done for defamation, and that Nicky, who's an old friend of mine, Nicky used to work for me, one of my presenters, and I asked him if he was okay, because the pile-on, and for him, the people were actually alleging it was him, and he's passed it on to the police. And I think he's done the right thing, because people need to stop this. I mean, in the old days, I used to advise people, and I'm a victim of this as well, that we'd say to people, don't give it any oxygen, let it die.
Yep.
Unfortunately, in the digital age, in the social media age, you can't do that, because it exists forever, and then it goes all around the world, and then some keyboard warrior in North America thinks, oh, this is all real, this thing that's happening there, these fabricated lies, and then they will kind of like spread it, and it just goes on and on and on. So what this has shown is that social media needs to have some form of control, because otherwise individuals who have no idea they have no media literacy when it comes to this, have no idea that they're breaking the law.
I mean, there's 2 points there I want to pick up on. I mean, we'll do the media literacy bit later, because that is a fascinating topic, but the law on it, Persephone, I mean, like, if you can't just say mad things on the internet about people, can you, that you can't prove?
You're absolutely right. Defamation law and the privacy laws that we have in this country don't just extend to mainstream publishers, they extend to every individual making allegations about another individual which are false or invade their private life. And that could include something that you say on Twitter or on any other social media platform. And, it's not strictly for the social media platforms to immediately be policing and be enforcing that. You will still have your own responsibility as an individual as well. So people need to be very careful about sharing, tweeting, retweeting.
Let's stay with the social media platform's responsibility then, because you say, what things got to be flagged, it's got to be reported to whichever company that the platform was behind. That's a bit of a slow process, isn't it? Because with something like this, it's escalating and it's snowballing every hour that it's not been sort of dealt with.
It can be, and they do tend to take allegations of the misuse of private information much more seriously and act upon them much more quickly than they do about allegations of defamation. Where you've got an allegation of defamation, the question is the allegation true? And social media providers often try to sort of hide behind the idea that they don't want to be the arbiter of truth. They'll leave that up to the courts or for another determination mechanism. But they can take action quite quickly, and I have seen them take action quite quickly, but it doesn't always happen.
David, what do you think about the way that social media is working in this particular instance? I mean, back in the day, I think in newspapers, wasn't the motto, is it true, will they sue?
The real problem is anonymity online. Anyone can hide behind a pseudonym or some label that isn't there themselves, and it takes forever to find out who it was who made the false statement. So the risks that are being run of being sued for defamation are eliminated, because the social media giants are in favour of allowing anonymity. I wish it weren't the case, but that is the case. I think, though, that there's an interesting little wrinkle here. If the Sun is declining to name the presenter because of fears of breaching privacy laws over someone who might be at some point accused of criminality, what do they do when the police say there's no criminality involved here? Because that takes away their legal shield. Then it's time to put up or shut up. They're going to have to name the person, say specifically what is alleged to have happened, because if it's not criminal, then they should be saying why they published the story in the first place. So I think when the police have done their investigation and tell us that there's nothing to see here, that's when the story will get really interesting again.
We'll see if that's the way the investigation plays out, won't we, David? Lauren, I mean, you will have seen some of the stuff that was going on social media. It was really quite extreme. And
it's brutal.
Pick up on this idea that people on social media, not only do they not have the sort of the law in their heads, but they also just seem to think that anything can be said because you're sitting at your computer or on your phone.
It's a free-for-all. I mean, I can go from it from a human perspective. So my client, I've dealt with lots of cancelled clients, and the first thing I generally do with them is worry about their mental health. Most of the time when they reach out to me, they're in a pretty poor state of mental illness, they're panicking, it's the scariest thing. And I tell them to log out of their socials, I log in them, and I experience what they're actually seeing, and it's death threats, accusations, it starts with one story and it just spreads. It's insane. I've never seen anything like it, honestly. And yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, just yesterday, well, the day before, all 4 names were trending on Twitter. And I feel like there should be a way to be able to manage trending topics on Twitter, because that escalates it so much further. Like 4 innocent names who then had to come out and push their innocence.
I mean, this is kind of sidebar, but there's a new social media platform that just launched that doesn't have trending names,
Threads?
right?
Yeah.
With Threads, right? I mean, that's not the answer, of course, because remove trends, but...
But we have seen that. I'm speaking purely in a personal capacity now, because some of the work that I do is in this area. But if you look at the investment that has been taken out, or of Twitter, particularly in this kind of area, if you've ever made a complaint about some of the things that are said about me, I'm a nobody, but some of the things that are said about me, real Islamophobic, racist, hatred stuff. On the odd occasion that I thought, nah, this has crossed the line, that I've forwarded it on, I just get a reply back, literally a minute saying, this is
I
what...
reported something earlier.
So you get... There's no point, is there?
No.
And I think this is the issue here, which is, if they're not going to do it themselves, how can we ensure that if we have that... I know you're going to talk about media literacy. How can we ensure that actually something is done to stop this kind of thing happening?
Yeah. We're going to move on to some of the legals now. Persephone, you're going to jump in. Let's deal first of all with the privacy law here and how this particular story may well affect the way that privacy law sort of works going forward. As David mentioned, this person at the centre of this has the rights to privacy. There's no reason why he has to be named. But privacy law has changed somewhat in recent years, hasn't it? Just explain that to us.
Privacy law has developed over recent years, and it's developed through the courts and their judicial interpretation of the law. There's been no change in the statute, which is what would govern and be interpreted by the courts. But we've seen a number of cases, and there was an injunction just last week, actually, to prevent the BBC themselves from publishing information about a criminal investigation. So there is more and more law on this topic, and it's all going in the same direction.
The direction being?
Anonymity for individuals during the course of an investigation. And indeed, that doesn't, just to pick up on something that David said, that doesn't just extend to a criminal investigation, but also extends to an investigation by a state body. Now, the BBC is a public service broadcaster. There will be questions in people's minds, questions in lawyers' minds, about whether or not that protection should extend through a BBC investigation. And then query what happens if there's no findings against this individual. That could mean that this name is... it carries on being below the radar, as it were, forever. And
I mean, that's a real possibility, isn't it? That this name never comes out.
Never comes out.
The person could end up back on television.
Yeah. With all the suspicion still surrounding the situation, and of course, again, not with this knowledge gap of not knowing really what the allegations were or how the investigation went. And I think there will be some pressure on the BBC to at least, now that they're under this level of scrutiny, to really be seen to be and making sure that they are following through with the rest of this investigation properly and probably reporting on it in some way.
OK. Now, police have asked the BBC to pause their investigation while police officers conduct an assessment of what's going on. So what are the police considering? Persephone, back to you. What will be... it's a scoping exercise, they're calling it, right? So they're looking ahead. As you rightly said, there's no investigation, nothing has been launched, but they're kind of examining what's going on.
They'll be looking at the evidence that the Sun has and that the parents have provided. They'll be looking...
So will they go to the Sun newspaper themselves and what... demand that the Sun release sources of that?
Well, I think they'll go. I'm not a criminal lawyer, but they'll likely go to the parents and go to the alleged victim and be asking them for more information. Very difficult to have for the police to pursue a complaint with an unwilling victim. And they will be looking at all the evidence that exists. So you mentioned earlier the possibility of images of an underage child, which of course raises additional privacy concerns because we're dealing with the rights of children. And again, but because there's this knowledge gap in what we know about the allegations, we just can't really say more about what it is exactly that the police will be looking at. But bank statements, photographs, and reports and statements from the parties concerned.
And as the person at the centre of this says that it's all rubbish and refutes their claims, you mentioned, a complaint from an unwilling victim. Can the police still pursue something like that with this kind of law potential law breaking that they're looking at?
Yeah, the police can pursue it. It's sort of out of the victim's hands rather once a report's been made. But it depends.
But who would have to make the report? Sorry.
So it would be in this situation. We know the report was made by the parents. That's been reported.
Fine.
So it will depend on what evidence is provided by all parties. But if you've got an unwilling victim whose evidence is changing or is giving a certain statement, that's going to be taken into account by the police as well.
But at this stage, as we understand it, no law has been broken.
We just don't know.
We don't know.
Yeah.
We don't know what's actually happened at this point. All right. So plenty more to come on this Sky News special on the BBC in Crisis. And coming up after the break, we will look at the future of the organisation and whether or not this damaged its reputation. From this point on, we tell it all.
This is effectively a neonatal incubator, and just being able to bring it into your studio today is a pretty big thing. We're offering a way to make healthcare flexible within the NHS at the moment and other countries around the world. So this is a full neonatal incubator, which I've brought into your studio today.
Wow.
Usually, you'd probably need a crane to get one of these systems in, a massive, big, bulky, heavy piece of equipment.
And tell me what it's used for while you're putting it together for me.
So what you're trying to do is you're trying to keep a baby, when they're born preterm, in something called the thermal neutral zone. And you can think of it kind of at the temperature of a mother's womb. It means they're spending their energy on growing rather than trying to keep themselves warm. And it's the very base of neonatal care. So if you think of neonatal care as kind of an upside-down triangle, thermoregulation really is the bottom of it. Without it, nothing else goes well. So this is a device that really is meant to save kids and not just let them survive, but also thrive. And you can see, we've worked a lot on the usability of the device. So it goes up very easily, one button operation, included battery inside of it, and you've got everything you need. It's being used in the NHS to keep babies closer to mother and father in a very stressful time. We're saving time, money, bed stays, but also in countries like Ukraine at the moment, where because it's flexible, we can go down to bomb shelters and into NICU. It means they don't have to choose between keeping babies warm or the nurses potentially being maimed, which is a horrible state to be in, but we can offer them something that helps. Originally, I'm a product design engineer by background. We're given the brief to design something that solves a problem. With that, I watched a documentary. They explained that because they lacked what they thought was a simple medical device globally, so not just places where you might think of these, but parts of the NHS, US, they're effectively losing entire generations. I then told my parents about it and found out my mother was one of the first babies in incubation in the UK in the 1960s. I've got pictures of it as well. So it became a personal story for me then as well. I wouldn't be here without one of these. We've got our manufacturing in the UK, we've got more development to do. The vision of the company is to give smarter healthcare access to children. We've got lots of other products we want to develop. This is just the start. This is just our flag in the ground.
Welcome back. Now, this morning, the BBC published its annual report, including a list of its highest paid stars. The release was, of course, overshadowed by the scandal that the corporation is facing, but it does remind us that the broadcaster is still publicly funded. So, how can the BBC recover from this scandal? I'm going to start with our BBC member on the panel before I go to David. The BBC, it's going to have to recover, isn't it? But how How much is his reputation going to be tarnished by this?
Well, I mean, I think the word scandal might be over the top in that sense, in my opinion. But actually, you know, I think you'd be very naive, anybody would be very naive to think that this isn't a bad period for the BBC, because actually you're living through something. When you're in the eye of the storm, it always feels like it's worse than what it is. I think when we look at this, when we get to the end, whatever that end is, when we get to the end, it may feel very different. Now, there are issues, I think, obviously, you know, Tim Davie mentioned earlier on about, you know, red flags and did we behave, were we quick enough, etc. I think that there'll be a root and branch look at the complaints process and how long it has taken. I think that's the right thing to do. But in terms of what has happened, this is part of the world we live in now. You know, people may have portfolio careers, so then there are issues about whether or not how much they represent the BBC, and then there are issues about whether or not there's been any illegality. So I think when we get to the end of this, I think the BBC will, you know, not knowing what's going to happen. It depends on whether or not it becomes bigger and bigger, and loads of people come out of the woodwork, and there's loads of illegality. Then it will be really bad. Then we'll be back in the Savile kind of territory. But if it's as it looks like it's playing out right now, which is not illegal, but actually issues around morality and whether or not that brings a well-known face of the BBC, brings the BBC into disrepute, there'll be some short-term damage, but not the long-term damage that something like Savile really caused.
Lauren, what's your sense of it? I mean, the thing is, when you mention the Savile affair, and there's been other affairs as well of other high-profile presenters, these are cumulative, aren't they? In the public's mind, they add to this idea that the BBC publicly funded is not run as a decent organisation.
Yeah, it's not ideal. I think, like you said, it just truly depends on what the outcome of the situation is. I think transparency is key. I felt today, the interview, I didn't like the fact that only BBC were doing it. Like, why was no other sort of news broadcasters there?
You've asked to speak to him, haven't we, Jason?
We have asked, yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Of course we've asked. We haven't had an interview.
Oh,
but
right.
But you're in crisis comms. They were in control of the comms. That's the whole point. They control the comms. That's how it is. Yeah. Why wouldn't I? You would have said the same thing, right?
But I mean, just to explain the annual report, obviously, the questions were put in by journalists. But for example, the question had to be typed. It was then asked by a BBC person from the press office to the Director General. So if the Director General didn't answer your question, you certainly couldn't come in with a follow-up.
But that's control.
It is good control.
So the result has to be that they're more transparent in future. I mean, that sort of root and branch reform, it just sounds like the kind of language you hear all the time, doesn't it?
It's true, but honesty really is the best policy with this. And I feel I just feel more transparency, what happened within those 7 weeks. Why people feel it was far too slow. Explain why. What was going on? Was there an investigation? Like, how thorough was the investigation? I think just there's so many answers unquestioned and unanswered, and I feel it continued with today as well. Like, not many answers were questioned. Not many questions were answered. Sorry. I just feel transparency is key. I think BBC, obviously, they'll crack on, they'll carry on, unless it is something monumental, like Jimmy Savile's situation again. But I think from a social media perspective, like, I was looking it up, we've got some software, and like 92% was negative about the BBC across 3 different platforms, which is pretty striking, really. So they've got a lot to work with.
And David, what's your sense when this plays out? I mean, I know you think it's been overplayed anyway, but talk to us about that reputational damage. As I said, the sort of the cumulative impact of these kind of bad news stories about the organisation, about their high-profile stars.
Look, you can't get through this kind of thing without suffering collateral damage. And although I think Tim Davie has done pretty well in trying to handle the matter, we've seen far worse outcomes. If you remember the whole Jonathan Ross Radio 2 issue, where the BBC's behaviour in managing its own staff has come under quite severe attack. The irony here is that one of the reasons the BBC is so sensitive about naming the presenter is because of its grossly unacceptable behaviour with regard to Cliff Richard, which ended up costing the corporation £2 million in damages and costs, and where the judge in the case was scathing about the way the BBC had effectively blackmailed the South Yorkshire police into mounting a completely pointless raid on Cliff Richard's apartment, and then, sticking a helicopter on the story and putting it at the top of the lunchtime news. So nothing happened to the BBC as a result of that. Nobody was disciplined, nobody was fired. Tony Hall, who was then the Director General, even said the judge didn't understand the law. I mean, it's extraordinary. So the sensitivity here is so ironic when they had zero sensitivity about Cliff Richard, and where the evidence against Cliff Richard was close to zero. So my guess is that they're being as cautious as they can be and as careful as they can be. And I think Akhil is quite right in saying that eventually the storm will blow over and the BBC will move on. And that 92% negativity is short-term, very temporary. In 6 months' time, people will have forgotten the whole thing existed, let alone what they thought about it. So, you buckle down, you take the storm as it comes, and you come out the other side.
Persephone, how much do you agree with that? Do you think people will have just moved on from this in 6 months' time? I mean, of course, it depends on the outcome of this thing.
I almost think it doesn't necessarily depend on the outcome, but I agree with what Lauren says, is that it depends on their transparency about how they deal with the process, almost regardless of the outcome, what they need to show now. And they've built on that today by releasing their timeline. They need to make sure that the public believe that they did the right thing at every step of the process and that they're now being transparent about that.
I mean, even the fact that they brought in those sort of processes prior to, those sort of the investigations unit can't be a brand new thing. That must have been in place for a while. So the process is already there. This is the point I'm trying to get to, that it feels like a lot of these processes are already in place, and yet the BBC didn't seem quite to be able to live up to the same standards that it set.
We just don't know that. I think that's the problem.
Right, excellent. Jason, final thoughts from you. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I mean, talk to us about the BBC's reputation going forward, and you can't speculate as to where this story goes because no one knows, but,
Well, it's been like a tennis match, hasn't it, between the BBC on the North Bank and the Sun on the South Bank in the Shard, and the ball's landed in the net geographically at Scotland Yard, or that's what it seemed like. But it won't stay there. I mean, they will obviously come to the conclusion of their investigation, but it may not even stay there for that long, because you've got those tweets coming out from other presenters like Jeremy Vine saying something needs to happen now. You've got another story that's emerged on the BBC. Other stories may emerge. So whilst the BBC might have hoped for a little bit of time, and I think the Director General is looking to the long view, he's thinking, how's my reputation going to look in a year's time? Have I cut that middle ground? Because right now, information, maybe even within the BBC, isn't all that it needs to be for everyone to decide which camp they're in, which way they jump. So I think at the moment, we're talking about how they've managed this crisis. This crisis is not over. They're still in it.
Yeah, so we may well do a special show in another couple of days. It's our Home Affairs editor. Thank you so much for that. David Elstein, former BBC producer and head of Channel 5, thank you very much for your points. Persephone Bridgman-Baker, Carter Ruck, thank you very much. Lauren Beeching, appreciate your analysis, thank you. And Akhil Ahmed, thank you very much for coming in. All right, so I hope we answered some of your questions on the situation at the BBC, but as Jason rightly points out, we are still right in the very midst of this crisis. So there's going to be plenty more to come. But from us, that's it. So let's take a look at what the weather has in store for the next couple of days.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, it is warming up in southern Europe, but it'll be on the cool side here with unsettled weather continuing. There will be showers around this evening, some of which will be heavy and thundery and prolonged, mainly in the north and the west of the country. Further showers overnight, which will move east, but much of central and eastern England and eastern Scotland look to be dry. It'll be a little cooler and fresher than recently, especially in the southeast. Showers will spread to most parts tomorrow morning, becoming heavy and thundery in places again, but there'll be some sunshine too. Northern parts look most at risk of slow-moving thunderstorms. It'll be cool for most and breezy in the south, especially near Channel coasts. Now, the afternoon will be similar, but Central Ireland will be mainly fine, while Central Britain will turn drier later. Thursday will bring further showers, thundery, but they should be more scattered than recently, leaving more in the way of sunshine.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
And just to remind you, of course, that the situation at the BBC is sure to feature in much of tomorrow morning's newspapers. We'll have our extended press preview and news review. That is from 10:30 this evening, tonight's news and tomorrow's headlines. Now, joining Anna Botting from 10:30 will be the journalists and broadcasters, Jenny Kleeman and Ali Miraj. And scan that QR code that you see on your screen right now, and you can listen to the latest edition of the Sky News Daily. In this one, Kimberly is looking at the crisis at the BBC. You can subscribe for free wherever you find your podcasts and on the Sky News app too. Now, you're watching Sky News Tonight, and coming up in the next hour, a second complaint has been made against an unnamed BBC presenter. We'll have the latest on the crisis at the BBC at the top of the hour. Stay with us.